We got the best case scenario, and what a perfect encapsulation of genre romance. Episode 5 of Heated Rivalry, I'll Believe in Anything, is it captures the emotional high that romance readers are really seeking and thrive in. And it's telling this story so enthusiastically and earnestly, which is why this emotional payoff is landing. And it's such a joy to witness and to relax into. Relax in the sense of being able to trust in that joy, as we've talked about all season. And it's something that Jacob Tierney, the creator, has reinforced throughout interviews. And so all of the signs were pointing to this particular ending of episode 5. And yet I was still hesitant to speculate that that would be the ending because there was so much to get through in this episode, but we did it, and I'm so glad that I'm Coming to the Cottage gets the moment it deserves, the episode ending moment it deserves, and that we're now kind of in the back half. We've kind of gotten through the real emotional climax and crisis of it. This really is that tipping point, and we are in the home stretch now. And what a joy is going to be to continue to unpack that. And I think we're all kind of experiencing the joy of the emotional intimacy that we settle into in this episode. And we are obviously contrasting that, as we've talked about the whole season so far, with the physical intimacy. And that really takes a back seat in some ways this episode, in the sense that we move to fade to black for the more physically intimate scenes. But there is tons of physical intimacy in this episode in relation to proximity and comforting touches. We get our own hand graze. And as much as in episode 1, Ilya is pushing Shane kind of out of his comfort zone in terms of intimacy with the physical and that connection and spurring that connection and journey. Here we're seeing Shane kind of help push Ilya outside of his comfort zone emotionally and kind of have a soft place to land. And there are some small but really significant changes that have been made to the source material, I think, in effort of forwarding this at the same time that we are still so true to the book. And I think that this is really getting at the heart of adaptation. I have talked about in the past kind of my experience dramaturgically with adaptation. And when I have experienced it, it's a conversation of both distilling the emotional truth of the source material and the story of the source material, but also having ownership to tell the story you need to tell and taking ownership of that material and being able to make changes where necessary. And we've seen so much honoring of Rachel Reed's text here, and yet the structure, the design choices have filled in the gap, as we've mentioned, of the lack of inner monologue, at the same time that some small tweaks this episode that really come to light more clearly, I think, really elevate the emotional journeys as needed on the screen. Some of these changes, particularly in relation to Ilya and Svetlana, are born of necessity at first, I think, in terms of just scene partner work and that lack of inner monologue, that I think actually is just spectacular and really elevates what we're seeing and led to my actual audible gasp moment of the night. But we're seeing this structure really heighten all of the parallels that exist in the source material and kind of illuminate them in a new way that really allows us to see this full emotional journey. For instance, we talked last week about the parallelism of the emotional freakouts of Ilya and Shane. And so here we're still seeing a lot of that juxtaposition and parallelism, but we're also seeing the reversals of these characters. And so we have kind of like the structure of the whole thing kind of illuminating itself, and such clear arcs over the course of each episode as well, while still staying within the structure of the original novel. And so we have, like their meeting and that first kind of opening up, followed by, Ilya's freak out. We get the contrast with Scott and Kip, which becomes, of course, very important in this episode, and we will talk about that more. We then move into Shane's freak out last episode and the real emotional high of the club scene at the end of the episode and that emotional devastation. And then this episode, we are really allowing these characters to settle into themselves and to open up to each other. And we are also finding the fun and the joy, or these characters are finding the fun and the joy and letting themselves relax into that a little bit. And this goes back to romance as a genre as well. I think in relation to what I really appreciate about this episode and some of the celebration of this story and this episode in particular is, I think, especially in relation to conversations around romance and framing of romance, is we have a tendency narratively to dismiss the joy and to take for granted that joy and love are often hard won and fought for, and that the emotional intimacy is intimidating and scary at times. And I think we see that full weight given here in relation to some of these walls falling down and the kind of release and catharsis of that as we see these two relaxing into each other a little bit more, even as the world is still there on the outside. And so the initial obstacles, while still there in relation to the internal fight, because we know the internal monologue of these men based on the books. And I do want to be clear that, like, the show is living separate of that, and I do take the motivations of these characters separately in the show as well. I'm not considering them bound by the inner monologue of every moment of the book. These actors are finding these characters in ways and making them their own in ways that I think are really wonderful to watch. And obviously, this is an incredible episode for Ilya in relation to all of the emotional depth that that character explores and the emotional vulnerability that he settles into. But I think it's also a really spectacular episode for Shane and the reversal of that. And I think in relation to that, as much as we tend to discredit romance and joy in terms of kind of not taking it as seriously, I think too we can't understate the more kind of contained and seemingly reserved characters, and getting to see Shane open up and blossom in a lot of ways in that, but also everything that is communicated, especially during his conversation with Rose on the face, and really getting a peek at that inner monologue in those moments in a really nuanced way. And while I've only taken a couple of acting classes because I had to, sitting in active silence and really feeding into that is hard. Now maybe that's just why I'm not an actor, but I don't think we can discredit, when there's not as much implicit action or like an implicit goal to be working toward in a scene within the dialogue. I think finding those moments is really important. I think both of these actors do this so well, and that's part of why it reads so well in relation to this emotional intimacy. But before we dive all the way in, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. If that sounds of interest to you, I would love for you to like and subscribe and hang out a little bit longer. But with that, let's get into it. And so we're seeing this emotional intimacy spread throughout the scene, and we see it from the beginning with Shane and Rose, and this conversation that I have been quite looking forward to and was very excited to see that it was basically beat for beat or bar for bar from the book, with a couple of additions that really delighted me, because as a theater student, I was like, absolutely. And so here we see Shane really kind of grappling with himself for the first time, and the release of getting to name himself and his wants and desires to someone for the first time. Also in relation to staying true to the text in context of Shane and Rose's scene is the whole of it all, and that admission from Shane and the vulnerability of it, but also the turning point it is. He kind of relaxes into it, and being able to speak out loud this thing that he has kept inside for so long and has felt to some degree some form of shame over at some point, and being able to verbalize and declare what he wants and the relief of it. And we can kind of see him easing in that moment and kind of settling in to allowing himself these moments of joy and kind of lightness, both in the way that he continues to carry himself throughout, but also that we see this moment of humor there. He's allowing himself to joke about it. We see him and Rose settling in, joking with each other, her mentioning that he is very funny, and later the kind of banter they have on the phone call. But the way that that moment kind of allows for this emotional release, and there is joy there. We see him kind of hiding smiles behind his hand, and we see Ilya mirroring this later in the bar scene in Florida as well. And so they are experiencing this joy, and there is still this hesitance here. There is still this instinct to have to hide that joy behind something, but that joy exists nonetheless. And also building a friendship outside of the world of hockey, and a relationship, a significant relationship outside of the world of hockey, and the confidence that gives him to go after what he actually wants. And what he actually wants is Ilya, which springboards us in, of course, to the All-Stars game, which has also been highly anticipated. There are so many really high moments, especially emotionally high moments in this episode. And while there is a sense that it just keeps happening, right? Things keep happening. And sure, there is a world in which I would love for some of these moments to have a little bit more room to breathe. And especially when we get into Shane's injury, I think we'll talk about this a little bit more. At the same time, I do understand and appreciate the pacing of this, especially within the arc of what we have to work with, right? We have 6 episodes to work with. And whatever we feel about the fact that it's only 6 episodes, that is the structure we have been given. And so I think this is the story that makes sense within that. And also, like, I don't want to have to live in these moments too long, right? Like, they're important moments for these characters, but this section is really about that building of that trust and that emotional intimacy, and seeing these characters, especially Ilya, who has a history of deflecting with jokes that we see break down a little bit in this episode, and we see Shane getting to ground him in a way that we've seen Ilya grounding Shane. And jokes are, a part of that as well. But the kind of juxtaposition of that and the real balancing of that relationship in a really beautiful and wonderful way. But that is what it's about. And so we don't have to sit in the angst of it as much. We get to live in the joy, and the joy is so on display in Florida. And so the scene in the bar where Shane approaches Ilya, and all of the anxiousness that we see from Ilya as he sees Shane enter the room, that we see that he is the one that is discombobulated, and that Shane is the one that is more settled and confident, at least at the beginning of this scene, before they kind of like relax into this a little bit. We see Ilya fiddling with his ear. We see him kind of muttering under his breath when Shane walks in and chugging the rest of his beer. And then we see Shane relaxed with Ilya by ordering a beer, which I think is significant, right? Like, we talk about the ginger ale, and the ginger ale is obviously referenced, but I think there's something to be said. One, that Shane is meeting Ilya where he's at in this moment. One, that, or two, that maybe he has some nerves as well, surely. And also, too, that he's relaxed a little bit in this finding of himself. Not that you have to be drinking or a drinker to be relaxed and settled in yourself, to be clear, but we're working with visual metaphor a lot. And so we are in this conversation where Ilya keeps trying very hard to get Shane to tell him what is going on with Rose. And Shane does not pick up on this for a long time because he is focused on this conversation and reestablishing this connection with Ilya. And so there is a charm here as they're kind of bantering back and forth. They've dropped their guard in a way that we haven't seen before, and there's an earnestness there. Getting to see Ilya smile and just grin at Shane when he tells him about the personal stylist, a little bit in relief, because we know from the book that he thinks that Shane is going to tell him he's engaged to Rose, because this boy is so far gone, even if at this point he may or may not realize that. But at the same time, I don't know that that matters within the context of this moment and letting this moment live and breathe in the show, right? It's the relief of the joke of it, of kind of settling back. It's getting to say, I know what you wore, and the kind of ownership of that. Ownership isn't the right word, but like the intrinsic knowing. And this is where we're getting into too the joy of romance in relation to knowing someone so well, and the sense that this is your person in this way that we settle into. And we get to see the first peaks of, or more peaks of, Ilya as a kind of joker in relation to Shane in the pool. Beloved scene, but we get to see them goofing off and having fun. And we also get to see a peek of them on the same team at the All-Stars game, and this sense that, okay, this is also, of course, metaphorical. It's the fun that they're having on the ice and getting to have those blips of joy and be seen and hide at the same time. And the kiss on the ice, which is a goof off moment, but so joyful for both of these two. And we also get, like the metaphor of that, right? Like we are, or these two are working or shifting to work for the same thing. Now, of course, we see them, they're still competitors, but we also see the joy of them competing against each other, because that is an intrinsic part of their dynamic. And it's an intrinsic part of what I, as I mentioned weeks ago, love about rivals to lovers. However, you want to contextualize rivals in relation to these two, but it's about the respect there, and it's about someone meeting you where you're at and being at your level and being able to push you, which I think we see kind of illuminated or said out loud in Ilya's conversation with Svetlana before the All-Stars game, where she's kind of needling him. But it's that sense that these two are on the same level, and how much that means then to see them and getting to play. And it's also, a wonderful like little peek for readers of the book that have hopes for the future. But it's that relaxing and getting to see how good it could be. And then that kind of instigates this emotional shift. And like I said, Shane gets to be the brave one in this moment in bringing up this conversation. And Ilya is a little emotionally resistant. And it's interesting because I was talking to a friend who is only watching the show and has not read the books. And there was some frustration, or a little tinge of frustration there, even loving Ilya, in contrast to kind of like what it seemed he wanted in the last episode, with what he's kind of putting out at the beginning of this scene in the hotel room, where Shane is like, hey, I'm gay, I like you, essentially. And Ilya is kind of pushing against this revelation, right? He's joking, he's trying to distract from Shane saying the thing baldly. And that may seem kind of counterintuitive, but it's also like the scariness of the largeness of these emotions, which I think we will see obviously really illuminated later in the episode with Ilya. But it's a scary moment to kind of reconfigure, and obviously Ilya names the stakes for himself in this conversation. And also then we see those walls start to drop. And the intimacy of this scene is just so beautiful, because they are communicating in a way that we have not seen them, opening up, being vulnerable about emotional interiors in a way that we haven't seen. And not just from Ilya, from Shane too. It's hard for him to say this thing out loud to Ilya. Even with the depth of their physical intimacy, there is a vulnerability for him there, because it reveals something emotionally for him. And so we see them both being brave in this moment. And I don't think this goes back to this conversation of like, what is brave? What is big? What is, the emotional truth in relation to storytelling and romance? And this series following the arc of a romance and celebrating the arc of a romance so clearly. And so this is really, emphasized in this episode, where all of the physical intimacy scenes that exist in the book that are played out are fade to black in this episode, because this episode is not about the physical intimacy between these two. It's still happening, but we need to focus narratively on the emotional intimacy that is being built. Now, that is not saying that the physical intimacy is bad or that it has disappeared. It is simply that this is the part of the narrative structure we're in, and we need this kind of juxtaposition. And it's an acknowledgement, too, that this is just as vulnerable and important as the physical, and how they exist together. And again, there's also this kind of juxtaposition between the vulnerability of these two, though obviously Shane has a lot of emotional obstacles in relation to his vulnerability as well. But the moment of Ilya talking and opening up about what his life looks like in Russia. And Shane so actively listening, being present with him in this moment, and being an ear that Ilya doesn't have either. Like both of these two live very isolated lives in a lot of ways. And Ilya a little less isolated than we get in the book, and we'll get into that as well. I thought that this was going to be a shorter conversation today, but apparently not. So the moment where Ilya starts to cry, which I love that we got emotionally there in that moment, that he let his guard down that much. And I would never, expect that in that moment. That was a surprise for me in the beat of it. I'm very interested to know if that was scripted or if that was unscripted. It feels like it had to be a little bit scripted based on the structure, but it felt so natural. And the turn away, because he's still trying to hide, right? I promise I'm not trying to like break down all of the acting beats, but it's just such a beautiful, beautiful moment. And so when Shane crawls into his lap, especially when we juxtapose the emotional intimacy of him being in his lap just the episode before, right? They're face to face, breathing in each other's mouths, and Shane moves away from Ilya in that moment in episode 4, and we see him make up for it in this moment, which brings me to, I almost forgot, one of the most significant changes in this scene. There are some changes obviously, but what I loved was Shane apologizes to Ilya. In the book he references, the last time they were together and it being different, but he doesn't apologize for freaking out. They don't name those emotions in that way, and I think it was really important in this scene for him to acknowledge what that moment was, to name it more clearly, and also to recognize Ilya's feeling in that moment. And also that that moment is part of why Ilya is kind of reluctant at first or reticent, because he doesn't know if he is safe emotionally in that moment, because he reached out his hand the episode before and he was pushed away, and the hurt of that we saw so clearly at the end of the episode. And he's trying again to play it off with jokes while still trying to cling on to whatever piece of Shane he can have, and not really knowing what to do with all of this, right? Like, what does the future look like? We don't know. So we have to kind of muddle it through. And so he is able to emotionally kind of open up in that way because of that apology, but he's still really trying to hold it together. He's used to, as a character, being the one that has to hold it together, which we will see, obviously, and dig into in Russia. And Shane doesn't allow him to hide from him in a way that we see Ilya refuse to let Shane hide from him in the bathroom scene, especially, or all of the times that he kind of grabs his face, which I just love from a physicality standpoint. But there's also the intimacy of that refusing, you have to face this with me. We have to be in this moment together. And so Shane doesn't do that from like forcing him through any emotions that he's not ready to face, but allowing him to know that he's in that moment with him. And just the intimacy of that one singular hug and the kind of rocking of it, and how it again reflects the same position and intimacy we'd seen from just one episode prior, but we then like see the real emotional realization of it. And this, of course, is a significant emotional turning point as we see them start to talk more. And it's not just about teasing each other and referencing hookups, it's about checking in on each other's injuries much later in the episode and talking about their world together, talking about hockey, and also, of course, facing the death of Ilya's father, which I think we were all kind of anticipating based on the lead up and the kind of buzz around what this was going to be, especially with Ilya's monologue. And I love the way this was handled, because we get the lead up, same as in the book, where Shane and Ilya have not been able to resist each other and have a hookup before the game. And I also love this scene because here I think is a real important emotional turning point. One, we see Hayden kind of clock Shane again in a way that I'm putting a pin in significantly, because I'm interested in how we're going to chart Hayden clocking, or what Hayden is potentially clocking. But that Shane is like, no, 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 I can't do this, it's stupid, as he is actively putting on the clothes and walking out the door. And while it's obviously not a, verbal conversation or scene, he still has to act out the emotions of it while texting, but we see kind of a prime example of what I'm saying, the lines I'm saying in this moment are not what I mean. And we get to see the enthusiasm and joy that these two are finding in each other for this brief moment. And also when they're in Ilya's apartment and the getting to stay in bed that we don't get to see in the prior episode, that kind of moment of realization of Ilya's hopes from the fourth episode. And also that Ilya is emotionally continuing the emotional opening up, right? Shane is asking him questions that make him uncomfortable. And his instinct is to kind of lash out with jokes and barbs and keep up that dynamic of ribbing Shane. And Shane backs off. He doesn't take it personally, but then Ilya relaxes into it a little bit and apologizes and tries to give him as much of an answer as he can in that moment emotionally, as much as he is capable of. He tries to give Shane, and also like physically grounds himself with Shane a little bit. And also that Shane acknowledges what this is and immediately turns the conversation kind of into a joke, into safer territory for him, and allows that to kind of breathe and kind of allows the ease of that. So they're both recognizing what the other person kind of needs in that moment emotionally in a really spectacular way that is still fun and flirty and sexy. And this is also where we get to see the contrast of, as much as they love playing on the same team, they love just being able to play with each other in whatever way and the thrill of winning. And then we are immediately undercut with Ilya going to Russia and the phone call that stops all of the momentum, all of the music of the episode. And we pick back up with Shane in the locker room, where he is being a lot less discreet than I think he thinks he is, and that I had read him as being. So he's really going to need to firm that up if he wants to keep any secrets, because, they're gossiping basically about what happened to Rozanoff. And Shane is like, no, he's not sick. I don't know what you're talking about. And is very, very quick with that. But he's also really worried about him and he can't get in contact with him, and it's like showing how tenuous it is. And we see this contrasted too, right? Like Shane has this period of time where he cannot get a hold of Ilya. He doesn't know what's going on, and we see the nervousness of that. Also, I love that long sleeve shirt. And then we see Ilya returning that emotional olive branch of whatever kind, that's probably not the right word. And we get the video call, which is one of my favorite moments in the book because of the glasses. So I was glad that we got all of the real emotional high points of that conversation. And the way that Ilya is clinging to seeing Shane in those glasses is just so delightful. But it's also like, okay, this is what I need right now. And Shane is so present with him. He's like, I'm here if you need it, but he's totally willing to go with the shift of, like the physical release. And sure, that is not a burden to him, but within the context and the arc of this episode and what we're exploring, I think that is important because it's about that emotional kind of connection and grounding and what these two are discovering in these moments with each other. And also, Ilya having this moment with the glasses, like, sure, he does look cute in his glasses, but also for him, it's about this kind of intimacy of knowing this piece of him and getting this piece of him that he didn't have, and a piece of his life that feels so out of touch for so much of the beginning of this season. And then, of course, we see the full kind of emotional realization of Ilya's father's death, the conversation with his brother, which I think was a spectacular ad, and Svetlana's real expansion in this series, which I love it. I am so excited by this. It, of course, is going to have repercussions for the long game in a way that some of Shane's, I think, switches are going to also have repercussions for the long game, but in a positive way, I think. And so this scene, first of all, I think Svetlana was expanded, again, because we needed someone as an audience for Ilya to kind of bounce off of and to be able to understand his history and what the emotional and just regular stakes were for him outside of his world. And we're not going to get the internal monologue. He's very isolated. And so it was great also, though, to see him less isolated, to see him have Svetlana, and also like to know that he is choosing Shane anyway, right? Or that his heart, the whole arc of this is, I have this person who has grounded me for my entire life, but I'm picking the scarier emotional option. and also just how good a friend Svetlana is. I just absolutely adore her. And also the moment of the he of it all in that conversation. Again, I gasped out loud. It was late, so apologies to my neighbors. That was so powerful. That is new. That is a seeing of Ilya. And I think we've gotten hints that Svetlana potentially knows more than we may know she knows at this point, which I will be very interested to see how that plays out, if that plays out. But she is allowing Ilya to be himself. And I think that this is important as well because we're seeing Ilya really grapple this whole episode with feeling worthy of love in whatever way. And so we see a family that has not expressed love to him and is openly antagonistic to him, and he has to have his guard up at all times. He's felt this burden of responsibility, and we're contrasting this against Shane, of course, which we will get into more, but I think the platonic presence of Svetlana and that friendship cannot be understated because I think he needed to see in that moment. And part of what helps him kind of emotionally release is seeing in that moment that he does still have someone in his corner outside of all of this, but also how scared he is that that's not what he wants. And so then we get to the monologue, which was beautiful. I am interested from a technical standpoint because when Jacob Tierney said a 5-page monologue, lots of people were very excited about what this was going to be, right? I will admit I was a little nervous because like I've said before in episode 3, monologues are tricky. And I would like to see the layout of this monologue. I think that there were other things going on the page. Because if this was just like 5 pages of script, as I'm used to seeing them typed out, I don't think it was a 5-page monologue, which does not take away from the emotional depth of this monologue. I think it actually adds to it because I think the specificity of language and dialogue is so important. And part of, monologues are the easiest place in plays and shows to start to feel overwritten, right? It's where you get kind of like the narrative expo dump, or it's where, as an audience, we can start to wander a little bit if that emotional truth isn't clung to. And so we need to be really intentional with them. This is just my dramaturgy brain kind of clocking in. And as much as like we can say, oh, we're overanalyzing for these word choices, there will be a line change later we will discuss a little more in depth. You know the one probably. But as someone used to being involved in new play conversations and developmental conversations, these are conversations we have because these things are important. I've had entire script meetings where I go into the meetup with, okay, well, one time I went in with an agenda because I wanted a monologue cut. It was eventually cut. I don't think I convinced them in that moment. And I wasn't telling them to cut it, but I was making my case because it was undercutting the emotion of that moment. It was not allowing the characters to breathe or trusting the audience. And so here we have a monologue that's allowing us to see into Ilya in a way that we have not been able to see into him before. And that is part of why it works. But most importantly, it's because he's opening up to Shane. And the idea that Shane cannot understand what he's saying, but is so present with him and allowing this moment to have the gravity it deserves. And of course, then we obviously end with the emotional revelation and the confession. We get to see that kind of emotional vulnerability, and for Shane to see that emotional vulnerability and for Ilya to feel safe enough, and that he's the person that Ilya is calling in this moment of emotional distress. He is allowing this vulnerability to be on full display, especially when he says, English is hard for me right now. I can't do this. My mind is too burdened to even try and speak in my second language. And we see also the kind of line of, when Shane's like, I want you to teach me Russian someday, or I want to learn Russian someday. And Ilya kind of allows some of his insecurity to show a little bit when he's like, you would learn it with no accent in like a week. And you kind of see the echo of his insecurity with his English there, and the way that these two are really still communicating through this language barrier, and that is still a really important factor in this. And so we'd seen the physical kind of communication standing in for so much of this, and now they're having to kind of muddle through not only their emotions but the specificity of the language barrier, which we see with compatible in the All Stars game, which I completely glossed over. And I loved the moment we got to keep that, where, Ilya's like, I thought I knew what this meant, but I went and looked it up to be very, very sure that this is what I hoped it meant. And this, like I said, the specificity of language, and that he gets to be completely open about all of his emotions and his regrets and his fears. And we see this fear really distilled because, he says, I don't want to come back here. I don't want to be here. But we also see, later, briefly later, him still having trouble understanding or grappling with leaving all of that behind. You know, we'll get to the hospital scene, but, he says we can't do that still. And I don't want to discredit the weight of that choice for him when it feels like narratively an obstacle has been removed with his father, right? Like that this from a narrative standpoint, we've had this conversation in the hotel room. This is a problem. What does this mean going forward? And it seems like, oh, is this a way for Ilya to move forward? And in some ways, sure, but it's much more emotionally complicated than that. And so it's still a very risky choice and a brave choice. And this episode is all about brave choices from all sides. And like I said, it's how the outside world is kind of seeping in as an obstacle. Once the emotions kind of come into play, especially in a romance that's structured like this, it's about the external obstacle. And so these two are still dealing, like I said, with the internal, but a lot of this internal is driven by the external of their circumstances, right? And so that is the main conflict of this episode. And this episode is all about kind of leading them or pushing them into making choices, but it also starts with them making choices because Shane has made a choice. Even though I'm scared, even though this is big, I'm going to choose this thing. And we see the lightness of that kind of carry through for him the rest of the episode. He carries himself differently after he's come to terms with this and after he's decided kind of what he wants. He's still the same Shane, but there is more of a confidence and a looseness there that is really delightful to see. And from the moment he leaves Florida, he's basically glued to his phone. Now, listen, we've seen these two glued to their phones a lot over the course of this series, but there's something different there. There's something more substantial there. And so we get this really beautiful emotional release. The visuals of it were absolutely stunning. And it was fantastic. And contrasting it then so quickly with Ilya coming back and trying to find the groove of things, playing against Shane. This is his happy place. This is his safe place. And we're trying to restore this balance. They're going to meet up after the game. Everything seems to be good. And then his world is thrown asunder yet again. And this moment, Shane's injury is both significant, but also I think of all of the kind of beats or big kind of emotional high points I knew we had to hit in this structure is what deviates the most from the book or what I think we were expecting, book readers were expecting from this moment, but I don't hate it. Also, when this piece fell where it did on the episode, like, or within the episode, when I could see where it was falling and how much time we had left, this was kind of the moment I knew where we were going to end the episode for sure. I had kept myself, I was tempted to scrub to the end just to get a peek. I'm not going to lie to you, but I resisted. But here is where I was like, oh, okay, I think that we are doing this. We are getting the arc that we hoped for with this. But this is kind of, the final big push toward this before, of course, the push at the end. And so Shane's injury, I think, is handled both, very close to the book. We're a very textually accurate adaptation here, while also being a kind of significant deviation from what we were expecting, because this is a really emotionally high moment. There is a world in which this can be played for all of the angst of it. And I think that it didn't force us into that place because as much sadness that this episode has, it's more about the emotional vulnerability vulnerability of it. It's not about sitting in suffering. It's about the choices that that suffering or that sadness allows within the relationship here. And so we see the moment, right? The joyous moment of Shane turning back and this idea that they are in their element. And then that comes crashing down when Shane is hit. And so it's this idea too of the bubble that they've been trying to establish and what the reality of that looks like, because we pull away in this moment. Again, there's a world where we see and we're with Ilya on the ice looking at Shane, getting a close up of the devastation in that moment, but we are fully on Shane and we are seeing Ilya in this moment through the lens of everyone else and what he has to pretend in that moment and what that moment has to be for the rest of the world. And even though there's emotional vulnerability revealed in that moment where he's still on the ice, where he keeps asking about Shane, we don't sit in it. We're forced to kind of view it from the outside, which I think narratively does double duty. It's a stark reminder of their circumstances, and it's also a juxtaposition of how these two are seen by the rest of the world, then contrasted with what we see at the end of the episode and what is possible. So, what they thought was possible, what was their reality, all that was possible, versus where we're going. And then the other big change is a piece of dialogue. And again, this is a show that has pulled so much dialogue directly from the book. Even back, like I said at the beginning, to the Rose Shane conversation, which I loved. And I do want to say, I didn't talk about the flashbacks of that scene, which were done so, so well and kind of revealing. That's a moment, a kind of inner monologue reveal that we can get through the visual medium that I think just really landed. And for Shane, it's also an illustration or illumination of how much emotional connection we go back to the beginning, right? It's that first moment in the shower, and also that he's going back to these moments of them coming together and the joy that we see in that, the kind of playfulness of realization and recognition there. It's not, the steamiest moment necessarily, it's the lead up to those moments for him in that reflection, which I think is significant as well. But then in this moment, we're seeing him thinking about Ilya much differently. And so in the book, the line is, Ilya, they can see us, right? It's this concern that Ilya is blowing their cover, that they're being too obvious with where they are emotionally in this moment, and that the world is going to catch on. In the show, obviously, it is a concern for Ilya. Tell him I'm okay, he's going to worry. And him being worried about Ilya being worried. And this is significant. These are the kind of line changes, right, that we can pick apart. And I know that there are going to be a lot of people that miss Ilya, they can see us because of the emotional devastation of that. But at the same time, that is a reaction rooted in the external circumstances and barriers, which again, that is what this episode is about. But here we see that shift for Shane that is pretty significant, and I think will have long-term kind of significance in relation to how we see him think of their relationship and what the stakes are for him going forward, especially, into potentially season 2 and beyond in relation to the books. But that it's not the external factors he's thinking about in that moment. It's not his own cover being blown or their cover being blown. It's concern for him. We see the devastation of it. We see the reality of Shane being put on that board and, having to be talked through that moment by the paramedics. But we don't dwell on it. And then we move into the hospital, where I find great joy in a completely zooted Shane, surely more than Ilya, who has surely lost it over the past evening, because again, he's come back from losing his entire world, essentially, with the death of his father, and Shane is like the one thing he's clinging to. They have this moment of happiness, right? They're in their zone, and then his world is completely rocked yet again. And this scares him, I think, right? So we see him be the one to be concerned about getting caught in this moment because Shane, again, zooted. And it's so cute from a variety of angles. For Ilya is trying so hard to keep it together, right? He's like, I was so worried. I am about to lose my mind. I have had words with my teammate. That was another thing, right? Like I mentioned last episode that we know it's Marlo that takes out Shane, and what I thought that moment was going to be, if there was going to be more of a kind of tussle between Ilya and him. And I actually kind of like that that didn't play out, that there is still that camaraderie between the two. He's like, he didn't mean it. Both of these men acknowledge this happens in this sport. This is a danger that we're always facing. And yet, Ilya is so, so unsettled by this. I also love that it's Hayden that goes for Marlo, and just the way that we're able to see that friendship play out with not a significant amount of screen time, to be completely honest. But Ilya's trying so hard to keep it together, to keep his composure. And also, we see that this has shaken him yet again. You know, he has seen the potential to lose everything. His emotions are involved in a way that he never expected them to be. And this is scary. And so here we see Shane reaching out again emotionally, and Ilya being a little hesitant. He is not going to say, "No, I'm not coming to your cottage," despite how adorably you just asked me, completely zooted out of your mind. But there is no intention there, even as he's trying so hard to not blow his cover. The shushing on the way out the door, immaculate. Shane's like little desperate, oh no, under his breath. And that I love this scene. It's so short, it's so effective, it's such a nice like break. And the tonal difference too. Like we were expecting this high angst point, and here we have this kind of silly moment, but also a silly moment that's really grounded in this reality that is frankly pretty sad. And so we're watching this play out, and then we're in the home stretch of the rest of the season that Shane's out for, and watching it with his parents, his mom recognizing that Ilya's ribs are hurt, these two still communicating despite this, right? While we see that hesitation from Ilya in the hospital, there's still not an answer to this question, even if they are kind of not acknowledging it. So they're kind of still trying to go business as usual in this new usual, in the same way that before this episode, we had the years of secret hookups and not talking about it. And so they want to cling to what they can have, but they can't imagine anything else until they can. And the way that this was executed was just so well done, that we got this kiss and this moment. Now, I will say, it does have to be acknowledged, the timeline makes no sense for Scott and Kip. I do think, and I think I read an article or an interview that it was a little bit messed up, unfortunately accidentally. I don't know that it removes or negates anything that's happening. I am still hopeful that we will check back in with Scott and Kip. But according to Francois, they apparently did not play it as like a year's breakup. That was unfortunately kind of revealed when putting and laying the timeline out more, and realizing that that's how the timeline laid out. And unfortunately, I can kind of commiserate with that because the timeline is a lot. So it was like, I think they said they played it as like a 6-month-ish kind of break, but like they were finding each other. Again, it seems like it was much closer to the beats of the book. And so I will be interested. I think if we get Scott Hunter Night in episode 6 before we go to the cottage, I think that will help kind of ease some of the question marks we have about the resolution of Scott and Kip's story, because I do think that they deserve that resolution. But at the same time, if we're thinking of their story as the more kind of quintessential rom-com, in terms of structure, this is the grand gesture moment. This is the big moment, and it reads that way. And this is the big moment for this series, for Shane and Ilya, but for all of the couples within the Game Changers universe, but of course for Shane and Ilya here. And we see them watching this moment in the book and getting to see them coalesce in this way, getting the realization of the Scott and Kip storyline and the realization of what the significance of this is for Shane and Ilya in the same moment in a way that we can't get in the books because we're following two different couples, was just electrifying, because we get to see and experience all the emotional weight for Scott and for Kip. We, shift, kind of POV jump into Scott in that arena, and we see, the loneliness in that moment, him evaluating the fact that all of his teammates have someone in that moment, the moment of success, the pinnacle of his career, everything he has been working for and sacrificing for, and what truly crystallizes as what's important in that moment, and the grandness of that kiss. And also just the way it's celebrated in universe. You know, the announcers go, good for Scott Hunter. But also the reaction shots in this scene are some of the best reaction work I've seen in a long time, because the looks on Shane and Ilya's faces while this is going down, the way it has completely rewired their brain chemistry and everything they thought they knew and could hope for. The way that at first it's that hesitant where they're texting like, what is going on? And there's this little bit of hope, right? The what is this? And then their world is completely blown apart by this kiss and the wonder of getting to see that and that that is possible. And so this, of course, spurs the long awaited and infamous I'm coming to the cottage. And that choice that is made from Ilya in that moment. And so the emotional climax of the show, of this whole story arc in some ways, is this moment of choice. And that's what this whole episode is about getting to the moment of choice and the choices that are made from both couples and what they can hope for, what they can believe. Going back to the title, I'll believe in anything, and what this allows for them to believe. And so this episode covers a lot of ground. I think I texted my friends during our initial watch, things just keep happening. And I knew they would, and yet I don't think I was prepared for how it was going to emotionally play out. I was grinning through so much of this. I like had my face, a pillow shoved over my face, because so much of this was so easy to audibly react to, because we saw so much growth, we saw so much vulnerability, and we saw a lot of callbacks to the rest of the storyline that were really significant, you know? Going back to the scene in the hotel room as they're saying goodbye, you know, Ilya lobs out one more, you know, good night, Shane, and that kind of reversal of how that same interaction had ended just an episode prior. And so it also allows us, we're not mired structurally. You know, we talked about the third episode as kind of a break and a balm in between 2 and 4, which were very emotionally high episodes where we had kind of these emotional freakouts from both sides, the stakes of it. And then here we have a really emotionally high episode. There's a lot going on for these characters, especially or particularly for Ilya, but we also have so much joy that absolutely permeates this episode, and the gravity that that joy and vulnerability is given. It's not overwrought, and yet it's allowed to be what it is. It's allowed to be significant. It's given the time and space it deserves, even again within, you know, the pacing that is required or necessitated by the form of the storytelling. But the arcs of these episodes on an individual level, the way they play into the overall story arc, it has just been so smartly done. And we're headed into a finale. Again, the cottage is part 4 of the book. It's a full like 25% of the book. And we're going to get that dedicated time between these two and getting to see the juxtaposition of this entire series that had been stolen moments of time, revelation that they can kind of eke out of these stolen moments or communication across, you know, space through the phone in whatever way. And we're going to then get to see that juxtaposed against the physical and emotional intimacy and the realization of all of this in the last episode. And this is what romance is, right? Everything that has come before, all of the hard fought emotional battles for these two, this is the emotional payoff. Episodes 5 and 6, this is what romance readers revel in. This is what we are searching for and seeking. And the emotional vulnerability, getting to live through that emotional vulnerability, knowing there's going to be a safe landing on the other side of that heartbreak is powerful. And again, it's so easy to discredit the power of that, to undermine it. And again, this story is not undermining that, it's reveling in it. And it has invited a whole new audience into the joy of romance. We have seen the show explode in terms of fandom and reception. We have seen people clamoring for new episodes and picking up the books in response to these breaks and having to wait, and eagerly reading and consuming these stories, reading the rest of the books in the series, having a great time. And again, as much devastation as there was in this episode, it was always tempered by the joy. It delivered on the joy we've been promised. It didn't shrink away from that joy. And I don't think that that can be understated, especially because it's a joy that's filtered through an adult lens. And it's reminding us that that hope and that joy and love is worth celebrating. It's inviting a whole new audience into romance, and it is treating that romance, and especially the creator, Rachel Reed, the author of the books, treating the author with the respect, the source material with the respect it deserves. And this is really solidifying. I posited that this may be the best book to screen adaptation of a romance we've seen. And so far, it's absolutely delivering on that. Again, there are, whole chunks of this show that are taken directly from the text. And where we deviate from the text, it has been in a way that has only heightened the experience or kind of solved a problem of switching between the two mediums. And so I can't wait to go to the cottage. I'm so excited to see how this season ends. As usual, I've talked for a decent amount of time and still have only scratched the surface of everything in this episode. So there, of course, is more to discuss. And if it's significant enough, ideally, we can swing back in the future to touch on it as well, especially as we kind of are able to look at this whole series in retrospect and as a whole, which will be coming next week. And it will be delayed by the holiday, unfortunately. So I so appreciate you for being interested in what I have to say, going on this journey with me together in experiencing this show. So I hope that you will join me next week as well, though it will, of course, be delayed by the holiday and me enjoying time with my loved ones. But thank you so much for being here. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.